Beneath the flawless faces, sculpted silhouettes, and silver screen illusions of old Hollywood, there were secrets the studios never wanted you to see. While the public swooned over their glamour, many of the most iconic stars were hiding physical deformities, disabilities, and life-altering injuries, all meticulously concealed with prosthetics, lighting tricks, corsets, and even surgical intervention. In an industry obsessed with perfection, these actors and actresses endured pain, shame, and secrecy just to stay in the spotlight. Some went so far as to alter their bodies permanently, while others masked tragic impairments that would have ended their careers if exposed. These are the hidden truths behind the golden glow, the dark side of Hollywood's most untouchable icons. Number 14. Lon Chaney Sr. They called him the man of 1,000 faces, but what they didn't tell you is how many of those faces he created by mutilating his own body. Long before CGI, long before makeup artists had entire trailers on set, Lon Chaney was a one-man horror studio. He didn't just act, he transformed. For his haunting role in The Phantom of the Opera, he shoved wire into his nose to hook it back like a skeleton. He used fish skin to simulate burns. He glued his ears to his head, popped in sharp false teeth, and even wore a painful self-made eye contraption to make one socket bulge out grotesquely. He played the grotesque and the deformed not with sympathy but with intensity, rawness, and terrifying realism. Audiences in the 1920s screamed when he appeared on screen. But what they didn't know was how much he was suffering off-screen. Chaney had a son, and even at home he refused to break character while preparing for a role. He believed physical pain brought emotional authenticity. He wore tight body bindings, distorted his limbs with hidden straps, and invented custom prosthetics, so extreme that no one else in Hollywood could replicate his work. And here's the darkest part. Lon Chaney wasn't deformed, but he made himself look deformed over and over because he knew what the studios didn't want to admit, that audiences were fascinated by the grotesque as long as it was safely hidden behind the mask of art. Number 13. Montgomery Clift. He was Hollywood's golden boy, the tortured heartthrob with a face so flawless it barely needed lighting. Women adored him, men respected him, and directors praised his raw, emotional power. But on a rainy night in 1956, all of that shattered, literally. Montgomery Clift was driving home from Elizabeth Taylor's house, where he crashed into a telephone pole just yards from her driveway. The wreck was so violent, his face was crushed, teeth knocked out, jaw broken, nose shattered. He was unrecognizable. Elizabeth Taylor herself had to pull shards of teeth from his throat so he wouldn't choke to death before the ambulance arrived. And yet he came back with metal plates in his face, nerve damage that left parts of his mouth frozen, and a new asymmetrical look that was impossible to ignore. But the studios tried to ignore it. They used soft focus lenses, shot him only from the good side, and layered on heavy makeup to preserve the illusion of perfection. But you can see it if you know where to look in films after the crash like Raintree County and Suddenly last summer. His speech is slower, his smile stiff and haunted. His pain was not just method acting, it was real. He was physically broken, and the industry pretended it never happened. They called it the longest suicide in Hollywood because behind those sorrowful eyes was a man who knew he'd never be the same and yet kept performing anyway. Number 12. Harold Lloyd to the world. Harold Lloyd was the daredevil comedian. The man who dangled from clock towers, leapt for moving trains, and performed stunts so wild they made your palms sweat. But what audiences didn't know was that this fearless performer was doing it all with only one full hand. In 1919, at the height of his silent film fame, Harold was handed what he thought was a fake prop bomb for a publicity photo. It exploded in his hand. He lost his thumb and index finger, nearly lost his eye, and could have died. The newspapers thought his career was over, but Lloyd didn't just return. He returned bigger than ever with a specially designed prosthetic, glove, thin, flesh-colored, and complete with rubber fingers. He continued to do his own stunts, never telling fans that his right hand was a lie. He climbed buildings, he swung from ropes, and no one knew he was gripping those ledges with a fake grip. Studio executives and publicists worked hard to keep it a secret. Not because they were ashamed, but because they knew the illusion of invincibility was part of his brand. He was the everyman who laughed in the face of danger. And the reality, that he was doing all of it with a crippling disability, made him even more heroic, if only anyone had known. His glove was so convincing most of his co-stars didn't even realize. Until his death in 1971, Harold Lloyd never exploited his injury for sympathy. He just kept climbing. Number 11. Bela Lugosi. He was Dracula. The cape, the stare, the accent. Bela Lugosi didn't play the vampire. He became it. So much so, he was buried in full costume. But behind the cape, behind the legend, was a man slowly being devoured from inside out. In his later years, Lugosi was in constant agony, a result of years of untreated sciatica, an excruciating nerve condition that made it nearly impossible to stand upright. He wore a hidden back brace under his iconic tuxedo to simply walk across a set. Sometimes the pain was so bad he collapsed between takes. But it didn't stop there. To cope, Lugosi turned to morphine, prescribed it first, then abused in secret. The addiction took hold silently. The studios turned a blind eye. They needed his name, not his health. And Lugosi, desperate to stay in the limelight, kept going, accepting roles in low-budget horror flicks just to stay alive. The man who once terrified the world couldn't even get hired for speaking parts by the 1950s. His decline was so tragic that in 1955 he became one of the first celebrities to publicly enter rehab, shocking fans who had no idea the legendary Count Dracula was now battling a very human kind of monster, addiction. When he died penniless and forgotten by most of Hollywood, his final request was granted. He was buried in the Dracula cape. But the real horror story wasn't on screen. It was in the pain he hid, the morphine he swallowed, and the career he watched fade, one hidden brace, one pill at a time. Number 10. Lionel Barrymore. You probably remember him as the grumpy old Mr. Potter in It's a Wonderful Life. Bitter, cold, and commanding from his wheelchair. What most people didn't realize was that chair wasn't a prop. It was his reality. Lionel Barrymore came from Hollywood royalty, a towering figure of early cinema. But behind the scenes, he was in a private war with his own body. In the 1930s, after a series of injuries, a broken hip, and worsening degenerative arthritis, Barrymore lost the ability to walk. He was permanently paralyzed from the hips down. But instead of stepping away, Barrymore adapted. He refused to be discarded by the studio system. Roles were rewritten around his wheelchair. Set pieces were redesigned to frame him as powerful and in control. He played doctors, judges, tycoons, never pitiful, always dominant. And that was the magic the audience never knew. They thought he was just acting old or feeble. In truth, Barrymore was acting through pain, through paralysis, and with a willpower stronger than most action heroes. He became a symbol of resilience, without ever asking to be. In a time when disability was hidden, even feared, Lionel Barrymore stared down and kept performing. He once said, "So long as people want to see me, I'll keep going, chair or no chair." And he did. Number 9. Judy Garland. She was America's sweetheart, the girl who sang over the rainbow and made millions believe in magic. But behind the voice, behind the smile, Judy Garland's body was breaking, and the world never saw it. From the time she was just a child, Judy wasn't treated like a person. She was a product. MGM executives put her on a brutal regime of pills, stimulants to keep her working, sedatives to make her sleep. She was forced to diet constantly, wear tight corsets, and undergo extreme posture correction, including spinal braces to fix her natural slouch. She was told she wasn't pretty enough. Her nose was too round, her waist too thick, so they cinched her, patted her, bleached her teeth, and even forced her to wear dental caps and wigs as a teenager. By her 20s, Judy had chronic back pain, fatigue, and a body ravaged by the effects of years of chemical control. She wore support braces under her costumes, even for light scenes, just to stand up straight. Her posture issues were often chalked up to clumsiness, but they were the result of real physical damage. And it didn't stop when the cameras did. Her body became a battlefield between the studio's demands and her collapsing health. Addiction followed. Breakdown followed. The audience kept cheering. But Judy, she was crumbling. She sang like an angel. She smiled like a star. But her body told another story, one of exploitation, pain, and a little girl who never got to grow up without being broken down. Number 8. Joan Crawford. She was the blueprint for old Hollywood glamour. Fierce eyebrows, sculpted cheekbones, power in every frame. But to maintain that image, Joan Crawford endured a private kind of torture. because behind the designer gowns and dazzling smiles were feet so mangled they could barely hold her up. Joan was a dancer before she was a star, and years of intense rehearsal in tight, ill-fitting shoes left her with severely deformed feet, bunions, overlapping toes, and chronic pain. But she wouldn't let that stop her. Instead, she had custom shoes made not for comfort, but to hide the damage. Pain was the price of beauty, and it wasn't just her feet. Crawford wore shoulder and hip pads to exaggerate her famously sharp silhouette even off camera. She reportedly taped her face back before makeup, used corsets so tight they left bruises, and wore false teeth as she aged. But perhaps most chilling was her obsession with control. Every inch of her body had to be perfect, no matter the cost. In public, she was high school perfection. In private, she was a woman wrapped in padding, supports, and painkillers just to get through the day. Her body became an illusion maintained through discipline, pain, and secrecy. Joan Crawford didn't just play powerful women. She constructed one from the ground up with foam, steel, and an iron will. And Hollywood never questioned it, because all they saw was the performance. Number 7. Bette Davis. She had the stare, piercing, defiant, unforgettable. Directors loved it, critics raved about it, and audiences couldn't look away. But what most people never knew was that Bette Davis's famous eyes were the result of a hidden condition and years of struggle to hide it. In the early 1930s, Davis suffered from a severe bout of neurodermatitis and a series of undiagnosed infections, which left her with one eye slightly bulging and immobile. The muscles around it never fully recovered. Her right eye didn't track, quite the same as the left, giving her gaze a sharp, almost unnatural intensity. It became her signature, but for Davis, it was a constant insecurity. Hollywood lit her differently. Directors framed her carefully. Soft focus lenses and strategic shadows were used to downplay the asymmetry. In candid photos, you can sometimes see it. One eye with a slightly haunted, widened look that never quite matches the other. But Davis didn't just accept it. She weaponized it. She leaned into the harsh lighting. She commanded the camera, turning what others saw as a flaw into a kind of superpower. And when critics mocked her for being too intense or too severe, she laughed all the way to 2 Oscars. Still, behind the bravado, she was deeply self-conscious. She knew that if she'd come up 10 years later, the studio might have passed on her entirely because in Hollywood, a woman's face wasn't just her tool, it was her currency. And Bette Davis, she made the world pay with interest, one hard stare at a time. Number 6. Veronica Lake. She was the ultimate blonde bombshell. Icy, mysterious, with that famous peekaboo hairstyle cascading over one eye. Veronica Lake didn't just look like a star. She defined an era. But what most people never knew was that the iconic look that made her a legend was designed to hide a disability. Lake had a condition called strabismus, a mild but visible misalignment of the eyes. In close-ups, one eye would drift slightly off, giving her gaze a dreamy, faraway look. The studios panicked. In an industry obsessed with symmetry and control, anything that made a star look off was a risk. Their solution? Cover it, literally. Her now famous hairstyle, long flowing, and always just so over one eye, was crafted to mask the drift. It worked. Audiences were hypnotized. She became a fashion phenomenon. Women across America started copying the look. But Veronica, she could barely see. The hairstyle interfered with her vision so much that the US government asked her to publicly change it during World War II because women working in factories were imitating her and getting injured. So, she adjusted reluctantly. But there was more. Later in life, she revealed she was nearly blind in one eye. Whether from the condition itself or years of covering it up, she never said. What she did admit was that the industry loved her for her look and discarded her once it changed. The irony. The very thing that made her famous, that seductive, mysterious eye, was born out of a disorder she was taught to hide. And when she lost the look, Hollywood stopped looking at her altogether. Number 5. Peter Lorre. You know the face, the bulging eyes, the whispery, unsettling voice. Peter Lorre was the man who could make your skin crawl with just a glance. And that was exactly what Hollywood wanted. But what they didn't tell you was that his unforgettable screen presence came from a real physical deformity. he spent his life trying to manage. Laurie was born with ptosis, a condition that caused one of his eyelids to droop lower than the other. On camera, it gave him an off-kilter, haunted expression, perfect for playing creeps, killers, and tortured souls. In M, his breakout role, he was so convincing as a child that audiences screamed at him in public for years afterward. But behind the scenes, Laurie hated that look. He considered his face a curse. Studios encouraged him to play up the asymmetry with lighting and shadows. When he tried to break out of horror roles and play romantic or heroic characters, the answer was always the same. You look too strange. He tried to correct the ptosis with special contact lenses, thick, uncomfortable pieces of glass that blurred his vision and gave him headaches. Sometimes he wore makeup to try and balance the eyes. It never worked. Hollywood had locked him in a box. He wasn't allowed to be a man. He was a type. The eerie foreigner, the nervous killer, the madman. All because of a condition he never chose and couldn't control. Laura once said, "All I've ever been is a face people think they recognize and fear." And while the world remembered the fear, they forgot the man, the one who carried his difference like a weight no one ever asked him to lift. Number 4. John Garfield. He had the smolder, the streetwise charm, the kind of raw masculinity that felt real because it was real. John Garfield wasn't born in Hollywood. He fought his way there. But beneath the rugged exterior and rebellious spirit was a secret he never spoke of. His heart was broken from the start. Born in a New York tenement, Garfield suffered from rheumatic fever as a child, which left him with permanent heart damage. It was the kind of condition that should have kept him out of the spotlight, off the stage, and far from the grueling demands of Hollywood. But he didn't care. He fought in the streets, trained as a boxer, and pushed himself relentlessly. Even though his doctors warned him he was on borrowed time, he collapsed more than once on set. He skipped medical treatments. He chain-smoked. He drank. He hid the fact that every time he ran, punched, or even kissed a co-star, he was risking his life. Studios had no idea. Or if they did, they looked away because Garfield was hot both commercially and physically. He wasn't polished like Gary Grant or groomed like Clark Gable. He was real, and that made him dangerous to the audience and to himself. But the stress caught up with him. Political blacklisting, constant surveillance, and pressure to testify during the Red Scare only worsened his condition. At just 39 years old, his heart gave out. He died alone in a friend's apartment. The official cause, a heart attack. But the truth, he was a man who never had a chance to grow old. John Garfield lit the screen like fire. And like fire, he was gone too fast. Number 3. Richard Boone. He was the face of the American West, weathered, tough, with a voice like gravel and eyes that seemed to see through lies. But there was one feature that Richard Boone never talked about. One part of his face that set him apart, shaped his image, and quietly haunted him throughout his career. His nose. Boone had a badly broken and crooked nose, the result of a rough and tumble youth. Some say it came from boxing, others from bar fights or even military service. Either way, by the time he reached Hollywood, his nose was permanently deformed, bent sharply to one side with a visible ridge that makeup could never quite hide. In a town obsessed with symmetry, Boone stood out. He wasn't a matinee idol, he was the anti-idol. His face had charm. It challenged. It made you lean in. Directors loved it for villains, soldiers, outlaws. But off camera, Boone was deeply aware of how his appearance limited him. He joked about it, but he also knew this face meant, "I'll never play the romantic lead." There were whispers he considered surgery. He didn't. Instead, he made it part of his brand. His face became a weapon, one of authenticity in an industry made of wax. And maybe that's why he thrived in television where characters were rougher, more real. In Have Gun, Will Travel, Boone's uneven face, broken nose, and gravelly presence weren't liabilities. They were his legacy. He didn't hide his deformity. He built a career around it. Number 2. Raymond Burr. He was tall. He was imposing. Whether as Perry Mason or the villain in Rear Window, Raymond Burr dominated every scene. But what audiences didn't know was that this towering figure had a secret, one that had to be adjusted, padded, and corrected from the ground up. Burr had a leg-length discrepancy. possibly the result of a wartime injury, though the exact cause was never made public. One of his legs was visibly shorter than the other, just enough to affect his walk and throw off his posture. But in Hollywood, especially for leading men, symmetry wasn't optional. It was everything. The solution? Built-up shoes. Custom-made, carefully matched, and almost invisible on camera. Burr wore them in nearly every production to maintain his height, his balance, and his commanding stance. If you look closely in certain behind-the-scenes photos, you'll notice one heel just slightly higher, a small tilt that gave him the illusion of total control. But it wasn't just about appearance. Without those shoes, Burr would develop pain, fatigue, and difficulty standing for long takes. Sometimes he also used hidden lifts and scenes with taller co-stars to preserve his authority. Not out of vanity, but because the screen demanded dominance. And dominance is exactly what he gave. Audiences never saw the small corrections. All they saw was the giant in the room. Raymond Burr wasn't born balanced, he just made it look that way. Number 1. Sharon Tate. They called her the oomph girl, a sultry, no-nonsense beauty with a sharp wit and sharper screen presence. And Sharon Tate had the looks, the voice, the fire. But behind that Hollywood shine was a quiet struggle, one that even today remains a Hollywood mystery. In her later years, rumors swirled about Tate suffering from Bell's palsy, a form of facial paralysis that can strike suddenly, leaving part of the face frozen, expressionless. For an actress in the golden age, where close-ups were everything, this kind of condition could have ended a career overnight, and maybe that's why it was never officially acknowledged. Insiders whispered that Sharon sometimes experienced mild facial drooping, particularly around her mouth and cheek. She reportedly had difficulty with certain expressions which were subtly corrected with clever camera angles, heavy contouring makeup, and careful lighting setups. Scenes were occasionally blocked to keep her on her strong side. In some late career photos, if you know what to look for, it's there, barely perceptible, but present. Unlike others on this list, Tate's struggle wasn't widely known, not even to her fans. She was never pitted, never sidelined. And maybe that's the most remarkable part. She kept acting, kept working, and never let the camera catch her weakness. Whether the rumors were true or not, what's certain is this: Sharon Tate understood the rules of the game. In Hollywood, you didn't let them see you sweat or stumble or freeze. You just smiled, even if half your face didn't want to.